Before we get started, my fairy fantasy novel, The Ghost of Nothing, is now an audiobook. Be sure to check it out. There are fairies on the farm. In the summer of 2012, I took my family to the redwood forest in California, where we camped in a tent. At about 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard a woman screaming at regular intervals. It was pretty far away at first, and the more I listened, the more I started to doubt that the sound was human. The sound was coming steadily closer to our campsite. When the sound was about 50 yards away, I could hear at the end of each scream what sounded like the beeping of a bird, like a finch. I thought it was some sort of animal at this point, although I'd never heard of an animal that made this kind of sound. It was getting closer. I'm a retired Marine. I served in the infantry as a machine gunner. But whatever this thing was seemed to force fear into me. I didn't have a firearm at the time, but I had a large knife and a can of bear spray. I stood up in the middle of the tent with knife in right hand and bear spray in left. It was in our campsite now. If it was an animal, its mouth was at least 10 feet in the air. It was still making that sound, the screaming and beeping, and the height at which the sound came from seemed to be 8 to 10 feet. Although at some point I felt like this thing was flying, or should I say floating. It then approached my tent and sniffed, at which point my small Maltese dog growled at it. It then proceeded to leave and scream and beep until it got further away. Eventually I could no longer hear the beeping, only the scream. The next day I went and talked to a park ranger. I asked if there was any animal that made the sound described. She looked at me like I was crazy. But I couldn't get that sound out of my head. During the past 7 years, I have listened to all sorts of noises trying to explain what I heard, and nothing has sounded like it. I ran across a YouTube video where the guy claims to have seen not a Bigfoot, but like a hairy ape man, and the scream he described was similar, if not the same, as the one I had encountered. He did not claim a beeping noise at the end, but said he heard a parrot noise, so that's similar enough. Incidentally, the area where the man had run across the hairy ape man is the exact same area I'd been camping in. My question is, are there any accounts of some type of fairy being that makes this noise or looks like this being? I've been camping in this area many times before, never heard that noise before or since. I know this sounds bizarre. This happened in Colorado. I was in my car with a friend driving down a country road. We were near a small bridge in the redwood forest. Nothing unusual was happening. It was evening, so the light was growing dim. Then, all of a sudden, we both started to hear the sound of hoofs clomping lightly on the road. It was a nice day, and we had our windows partly down. And then, as we drove along, we saw something ahead of us on the road. As we neared it, neither of us could believe what we were seeing. It looked like a half-man, half-animal creature with little nubby horns on its head. It was running, trotting in front of the car. We both got a really good look at it. We did think it was an animal at first, but as soon as we got closer, we could see him as plain as day. This was no animal. But whatever it was, He was amazingly beautiful, and we saw him in amazing detail. His top half was a human body that looked like a well-built young man, all the way down to the belly button. And then the bottom half was the lower half of a shaggy goat-like being that matched the size of the top half. He had small, nubby little horns coming out of his head right at the forehead hairline. He had light-colored curly hair that came down to the base of his skull, and his face was very pleasant. When the road got to a small bridge, the being ran off of the road and went down under the bridge where we couldn't see him anymore. We didn't know what to think. We were both freaked out. But while he was running in front of the car, we felt absolutely no fear, only a sense of wonder and excitement. It was one of the happiest events of my life. My friend and I that saw him were not on any form of intoxicants. I feel the need to mention that. We were completely clear-headed. I don't know how to explain what we saw other than that we saw a member of the fairy kingdoms, and I feel very blessed to have had this experience. I've had other experiences with the paranormal in my life, but nothing like this. I feel greatly enriched by it. I've had many experiences, but this is one of the more recent ones. It happened when I was around 20. My mom, brother, and I were all going to live in another state. I'm from Australia. We were heading to Queensland, and we were about halfway to the Queensland border. We just exited a town, and we're driving through wooded areas. It was dark just after sundown, and when I looked out the window, I saw a group of riders on strange horses that seemed to be sopping wet. They looked like they'd been drowned and reanimated, both the riders and the horses. That's the best I can describe it. It was dark, but the riders held lanterns that bounced as they rode. Neither my mom nor my brother could see any of this. I have some psychic ability, and this isn't the first time I've seen something like this that no one else could see, so I wasn't entirely surprised. But still, it was a frightening sight. The riders were all different types, some dark-skinned, some light-skinned, some tan-skinned, and they all wore beautiful, ornate clothing, albeit sopping wet. The group was full of lanterns. You could see the lights reflecting off of them. The riders were galloping very quickly and actually keeping up with the car. I watched them ride along with the car for a long time. I'd say about 40 minutes. I was mesmerized by them and terrified at the same time, but I couldn't look away. When my brother needed to rest, we found a rest stop and got out to stretch our legs and go to the toilet. The rest stop was just before a country town, and as I got out, I looked around for the riders. I could still see them, but barely, just their lanterns in the distance as they seemed to be headed away from us now into the bush. That's what we call the forested areas here in Australia. I didn't see them again after that, and I'm glad for it. But that night, I did hear this haunting music and laughter and voices. And I felt this strong temptation to go outside, even though I had no reason to do so. I didn't, thank the gods, but I barely got any sleep that night. I've never told anyone about this experience because they might think I have a mental health issue. But I know what I saw and experienced. Another strange thing, the next morning when we went outside to continue our journey, we noticed next to our car this flower growing through a crack in the pavement. I'm pretty sure it was a flower because it smelled heavenly and looked like a flower. But if you stared at it for too long, it almost shifted into a thorn, a very large thorn. Now, both my mom, a gardener, and my brother, a technology-obsessed guy, saw and commented on this flower and how it hadn't been there the previous night. All the lights in front of the inn were on that night, so we should have seen it when we got out of the car. It wasn't there the night before, there's no way. And yet here it was in the morning, right on the path we had walked the night before. I'd never seen any flower like this before either. It was very strange. I know enough about the fair folk to know they aren't always nice, so I knew better than to disturb it. We went on our way and made it to the new city later that day. Since then, I've traveled around that area many times, but have never seen those riders again. But whenever we cross the border into New South Wales, all I can do is watch out the window for those lanterns. I know from stories what happens to some people who spot fairies, so the whole thing did leave me feeling quite uneasy, even though I always watch out for them now. I do hope I never see them again. I know they shouldn't be messed with or offended, so I think it's safer to stay clear of them. We believe a Thorn Warrior showed himself to us one evening near sundown in July 2011 in British Columbia, Canada. My son had his learner's driver's license at the time. I took him out practice driving, and we had driven up the mountain road and down through our neighborhood a couple of times. The second time he drove up the mountain, we got a sudden chill, and it felt like there was a presence on the mountain. This had happened in the past. There's a certain feeling you get when you're being watched by a cougar or a bear, and we both remarked on it. But there was something strange about this, like it wasn't an animal watching us, but something sinister. We put our car windows up. We were driving pretty slowly and scanning the woods, seeing if we could spot anything, discussing what we thought it might be. We'd seen a fair number of bears, and they usually ran away when they saw humans, so we didn't think it was a bear. My son said he felt a bit shook up and he wanted to stop driving. I asked him to drive down the mountain closer to home and we'd find a place to stop. Then we could switch up and I'd drive the rest of the way home. So we did that. He drove further down the mountain and pulled over along the side of the road. It was a wild and striking spot he'd chosen. Tumbled boulders were stacked up the mountain we had just driven down from, and there was a small waterfall. You could see the imprint in the land where there would be more water flowing in winter when the rain came. As we sat in our car at the side of the road, we rolled the windows down part way to see the striking little waterfall against the wild undergrowth and rugged boulders. My son said, "Are you sure we want to roll the windows down? That thing up there might still be around." But I dismissed his concerns. We'd lived in the area for a long time, and I thought whatever we'd felt had been nothing, or else that it was an animal that had probably wandered off. For a couple of minutes, we sat silently in the car with the engine off and the windows partly down. And then my son suddenly went rigid in the driver's seat. He was looking out the open driver's window. I had to lean over to see what he was looking at. And I saw it. There on the brambles beside the boulders of the waterfall stood a small warrior-type humanoid in battle gear. He was maybe 6 to 8 inches tall. The warrior had on a helmet of something hard with spikes lapped all over it like a kind of bird with its feathers puffed out. The helmet had pieces that protected his ears, kind of like a Roman helmet. His face was uncovered and he had no beard. He was covered neck to knees in brown leather, with ties at his elbows, wrists, and knees. He was all the colors of brown like an owl. He carried his spear in his right fist, and I had the impression that he was further armed but not showing it. His hands were big, work-hardened. He glanced at me, but was mostly focused on my son. They locked eyes for a couple of moments, and then my son said, "We've got to go. That thing is passing through. We're in the way." We didn't switch seats. My son started the car and drove us away immediately. We didn't go straight home. We drove all the way downtown to discourage, my son said, anything from following us. We didn't get home until a couple of hours later. We should have been home by 9:30 p.m., but we arrived back after midnight. I feel like we were both somewhat in shock because neither of us had ever experienced anything like this before. After we'd been driving for some time in silence and we felt safe, we started talking about what had happened. My son said that the warrior communicated with him, mind to mind, that he said he was a thorn. I don't know what a thorn is, but that's what he apparently said. The warrior said there were a lot of these thorn beings around, and that they were there to protect us humans from something else that was living up in the mountains. He didn't explain what that something else was, only that it was very dangerous. I think that's what we might have been sensing when we first had the feeling of being watched. The warrior said our driving had drawn the attention of that thing, whatever it was, and that he and others we couldn't see were trying to get into position to fend it off and basically encourage it to pass through without stopping and hurting anyone. And essentially, we were in the way. So my son got us out of there. I asked him, what was that thing? He didn't know. He just said we needed to get out of its way. And I said, no kidding. I asked my son if he'd ever seen or experienced anything like this before, and he said he hadn't. Honestly, I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it myself. My son said we wouldn't see the thorn being again, that he'd communicated to my son that he knew who we were, and that this was a one-time only kind of interaction, necessary because of the circumstance. He'd make sure of it, he said. I didn't know what to think. The whole thing was shocking. I'm not sure if I'll ever recover from it. This was real, we both saw it. Since then, I ensure we keep our garden welcoming. I keep mason bees and foster native plantings, and I make sure I say out loud to no one in particular how grateful I am to live in this safe place on the edge of the wild. Thinking about the warrior, he was 6 to 8 inches tall, right-handed, medium skin tone, brown hair. He looked tough and highly capable. Was much more interested in my son than me. Some man-to-man talk, I felt. He was dressed for war, no question. But the weapons and his armor were all shades of brown, like beak, claws, feathers, leather, and bone. No metal that I could see on him, perfectly camouflaged. I can only guess he showed himself because he saw it as an acceptable risk. He had a point to get across. He was deadly serious, all business. He was focused and present and deliberate. I should also say that my son took long walks through our area at that time, so it would not be surprising if the warrior recognized him from his frequent long walks. I think fairies are entities that live in nature and who have a different relationship to nature than humans do. Possibly they live in other dimensions that sometimes overlap with ours. I was out walking at dusk. This was in England. I was with my father. We were walking onto a track through the forest when we turned right towards a heathland. That's when I heard a sound. It was sort of a crunching, static sound, like an aggressive but corrupted form of jangling bells. That's the best way I can describe it. I turned around to see a dim lamppost throwing jaundiced light over a strange, blurry, disfigured, thin, tall thing, like something out of a horror movie. It just stood there in the center of the road and watched us. It was featureless, dark, and the sound continued, like the music of my nightmares, distorted and spine-chilling, and full of anger and despair. I grabbed my father by the arm, turning back ahead, and pulled him, running swiftly out of the forest. My dad thought I'd seen some kind of an animal. He hadn't seen the creature. He hadn't turned around. But I needed to get us out of there. There wasn't time to talk about it. We got into the car and sped home. It was only then that I told him what I'd seen. My dad's open to the idea of other beings living alongside us, and he was just glad we'd gotten out of there when we did. He did say that he'd heard a faraway sound like weird bells. I don't know what it was, but I think it was some kind of fairy. Why a fairy? Because I've had other experiences and you just get to know when something's distinctly fae-related. I think fairies are spirits of the wild, of nature, of history, and they inhabit the in-between spaces. They're essential to our existence. This happened a long while ago, in the 90s, but I've never forgotten it. I was in England, Oxfordshire, walking down a country track when I heard a whistling, humming noise coming from the hedgerow bottoms. I was with a party of 4 others who were all walking ahead of me. It was summertime, and in the morning around 7 a.m. I could hear the humming as I walked, but it stopped when I stopped. I took several dives into the thicket to see what was making the noise, but only caught a glimpse of things scurrying away. And then on my final attempt, I found something. It was a humanoid creature about the size of a man's hand. It was on all 4s looking back at me. Its head was similar to a mouse's, its body the shape of a toad. But it had a very human look about it, not least because it was wearing a pair of tweed trousers and braces. It was frozen to the spot, as if I'd terrified it to immobility. I exclaimed, and then it shrieked and bolted off into the scrub. My friends neither heard the humming whistle nor did they see or believe what I had seen. But I don't think I was imagining things. It was a material, solid, not a shadow or something I saw out of the corner of my eye. I got a good look at it. I think it was a fairy, and for me, fairy covers the other, the broad spectrum of beings that live in parallel to the human world. I was just leaving Glastonbury on a lovely summer day. We'd had a lovely weekend at the Glastonbury Symposium in the town hall. I was in my car, just beginning my journey home, when I turned onto a small road, and there, in front of me, was a creature. Looked like a little man made of twigs. I saw it but didn't stop the car or anything, no time. And then he was gone. But he was imprinted on my mind. My partner was in the passenger seat but didn't see anything. A few months later, when I was in Scotland, being driven to a beach, I saw something very similar again. I don't know if I was imagining it the second time because I'd had that first experience in my mind, or if having seen something like this once, I'd become open to it, and so I was able to spot it again. It was a fairy. I just knew. I felt it in my heart. I think it was a wood sprite. They're among us, I believe, wandering around about their own affairs. Thanks for watching, And thanks to all those who submitted their stories for this one. If you like what I do on this channel and you haven't already, make sure to check out my novel, The Ghosts of Nothing. It's about a girl from a famously haunted town that turns out to have a bigger fairy problem than a ghost problem. You can learn more about it on my website, linked in the description. It's available in all different book formats, including now as an audiobook on Audible. So if it sounds like something you might enjoy, please don't hesitate to check it out. Links are in the description. And if you like this channel, I really think you will enjoy it. You'll have a great time. If you have a story to share, you can check out the channel's website at scaryfairygodmother.com. Link also in the description. It has a spot where you can submit your stories, comments, questions, or suggestions. You can also sign up for my mailing list. I have two mailing lists now, one that's dedicated to the channel called Fairy Lights, and the other one dedicated to my writing. That one's called The Shaken Tree, and they're both linked below. As always, extra special thanks goes out to all my supporters on Patreon and to anyone who joined the channel, made a one-time donation through PayPal or Ko-fi, or joined one of my newsletters as a paying subscriber. I just appreciate you guys so, so much and the support you are giving this work. If you like the channel, the stories I tell here, and would like to lend your support, you can check out my Patreon page and the other support options in the description below. I've started to upload versions of my videos that are ad-free, stories only, no intro, outro for channel members and Patreon members. If that's like something that you're interested in, please consider becoming a member. The stories in this video came courtesy of subscribers and the Fairy Census, so thank you so much to everyone who submitted. The stories were edited for dramatic and narration reasons. To read the original Census story, follow the link to the Fairy Investigation Society website below in the description. Please leave a comment, like, share, and subscribe if you're new. All of those things really help the channel. And hit the bell to receive notifications of new videos. And until next time, this has been a visit from your scary fairy godmother.